Yeah, well, one of the really nice things about this process was that Luca and I were in the middle of making another movie,
Mm.
Challengers, when
Cutting out.
he handed me the book.
Mm.
He said, read this tonight and tell me if you'll adapt it for me. And I read it that night and I immediately said yes, even though I didn't know how I was going to make it into a movie on the page. But I was, first of all, just so honored that he would trust me with this task and so excited by the idea of not just this legendary book by this legendary author, but specifically getting to watch Luca make this movie was so exciting to me. And so before I even started putting pen to paper, uh, Luca and I got to just talk about the vision for what the movie could be
Mm.
for a little bit. So I was going into the process of writing it with all of those conversations and all of that sort of inspiration influencing how I was starting to carve out scenes from within the book. Um,
Mm.
but my main sort of guiding principle as I was adapting it was that, if you know Burroughs' books and you've read his other books, uh, it's very shocking when you read Queer to find that it's, for the most part, a pretty straightforward love story.
Mm.
There's a lot of other stuff going on as there is in all of Burroughs' work.
Mm.
And that stuff needs to find its way into the movie as well. But
Mm.
the sort of foundation of the story in Queer is this love story that plays out pretty linearly, you know,
Mm.
between these two characters. And it's really focused on the psychology of these two people trying to find some connection with each other. Uh, and so that was the thing I really held on to as I was thinking about how I was going to shape a movie out of this material. It's interesting because if you think about it as this book is like being in a trilogy with Junkie and Naked Lunch,
Right.
each book is written in a really different style.
Mm.
And even within queer, there's a section that's written in the third person, and then all of a sudden there's a section that's in the first person, and it's two
Mm.
years later. So even within the book, he's jumbling different styles together and different ways of writing, uh, which is when you're reading it and trying to think about how you make that into a movie, on the one hand, it's very daunting, but then it becomes really exciting because you realize that there's no one way to approach this, you know? And my way of going at it is just as legitimate as any other way. So I was really trying to, uh, even when I wasn't being strictly faithful to the book, I was trying to operate from within the spirit of the book, you know,
Mm.
and find where the book maybe wanted to go, but
Mm.
just didn't, you know. Um, so there are moments in the book where a door is opened and then quickly closed, and I wanted to see what would happen if we opened that door and saw what was on the other side, you know.
Mm.
And that felt like a kind of invitation that could only be made in cinema, you know.
Mm.
Well, it was a real question with the book because, as you say, it's in some respects unfinished, and so it's hard to say where the main text of Queer starts and uh,
Right.
where the rest of Burroughs' life or his work begins. It's a sort of open uh, text in that way,
Right.
and I found it useful to read things like Junkie and to read, his letters to Ginsberg and
Mm.
sort of all of this stuff that was about his actual life at the time. Uh,
Mm.
but then I also found it really important to look at Queer and see what he chose to leave out from his real life. You know,
Right.
like his Burroughs, the man, was in Mexico with his wife and his kids.
Mm.
Um, his wife, who he eventually
Sure.
shot,
Yeah.
which he speaks about as a sort of event that haunted the writing of Queer. Uh,
Right.
but she's not mentioned in the book Queer, not really.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
that
Uh-huh.
whole aspect of his life is really not discussed in the book. So I didn't want to make that a I didn't want to enforce that onto the character because it didn't feel like it was within the part of his life that Burrow had chosen to show us in Queer. If you read Junkie, there's a
Mm,
lot more discussion about the whole sort of journey that even got him to end up in Mexico,
mm,
which is that he basically had to flee the U.S. because he was a criminal,
mm.
because being addicted to
Right,
opiates makes you a criminal, you know.
right. Mm,
So he's a man on the run to some extent, um,
oh,
which that felt like an interesting thing to have him mention in Queer, but I
mm,
didn't necessarily need to show the audience the whole journey of that, you know. In a
mm,
sense, I kind of wanted to do what the book does, which is just drop us into this guy who's already there, you know. He's already living this very particular life in this very particular part of the world and time and with a very particular milieu. And yeah, I wanted to stay faithful to that and trust that the audience would just go along with it. Unless I'm writing something for an actor, unless an actor is producing something and they've brought it to me to write for them, I really try not to think about actors when I'm writing. I try to just think about the character.
mm,
Um, Mostly because, in the case of Daniel doing this movie, you can't be so presumptuous as to think that somebody like him would want to do this. My introduction to Daniel as an actor was way before Bond, when he was doing these really very edgy movies in the UK and his theater work, in the UK, and then very sort of hard-boiled crime movies and all this really amazing stuff he
right.
was doing. So I had no doubt that Daniel would be game for it, but you can never presume that somebody's going to that the stars will align, and that this will be the right project at the right time for somebody. So,
Mm,
which is all to say, when you write for a specific actor, unless they're already attached, you're kind of backing yourself into a corner.
mm,
Because what if they don't want to do it? And Luca and I were first talking about who could do this. When the idea of Daniel comes up, it's like a lightning bolt
mm,
because, we just felt like we have to try. Uh, because if he does, that's a sort of perfect meeting place of actor and character. Able to do a lot of research through Burroughs' own work, and
mm,
then we had the Burroughs scholar Oliver Harris, who was consulting with us on the movie, and he was really invaluable. And then we had our a researcher named Ben Penzeca, who did a ton of like really hyper-specific research into Burroughs's life, which I found incredibly useful, uh, not just from the perspective of the story, but even like stuff like what brand of cigarettes he would smoke, or what kind of gin he would drink, and all of that stuff or what he liked to wear, how, all of the stuff that builds the world of Burroughs and the world that he's existing in. So that kind of stuff is really fun to look into. But I
mm,
think when it came to writing the character, I wanted to be really clear that we were not making a movie about William S. Burroughs, the man,
mm,
but we were making a movie about William Lee, the character, and
mm,
Allerton, the character.
right.
Um, and so whatever was useful from Burroughs's real life that could inform the character was something that we brought into the story, but whatever we didn't find useful, we pushed away. And that was
Nice.
kind of that's what you have to do uh, to make a narrative story instead of a documentary or something. It's hard to say. I mean, I think it certainly wasn't published after
Right.
Junkie, and that had everything to do with the themes of the book, you know.
Mm,
But at the same time, queer literature has been published since the beginning of literature. Uh,
right.
you know, even if it wasn't acknowledged that that's what was being published. There's queer books that date back to, ancient times. There's plays by the Greeks that were queer
Mm,
plays, that. So I don't think I think it was certainly possible for
Mm,
the text to get out into the world. Um, but the circumstances of uh, the either the publishing industry or if Burroughs' life made it so that that didn't happen. But I don't think it's an impossibility.
mm,
But I do think there's something really beautiful to me about the idea that this book gets published in the 80s, uh, and somebody like Luca, who's a teenager at the time, uh, discovers this book,
mm,
and it discovers it as a new book, uh,
mm.
not as a something that came from a long time ago, but that's just getting out into the world. Uh,
Right. That's so true.
there's
Right.
something really that I find very touching about that. So, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think coming into reading the book for the first time, I had a conception of William S. Burroughs as this very austere, gruff, macho
Mm,
writer, and the guy who had an obsession with guns his whole life and would hang out with people like Kurt Cobain, and there was something so cool about him,
mm,
which I was completely seduced by when I first encountered Burroughs as a teenager, myself. But I was really surprised when I read Queer to find that the character Lee was this very tender at times and very sweet and very embarrassing guy who
mm,
didn't know what to say, and sometimes wouldn't know when to shut up and would try to look cool and then his body would betray him, and he would end up making a fool of himself because he was so in love or so desperate for connection. Um,
mm.
and that to me felt like very different from the Burroughs I had come to understand through his other work and through his public persona.
I
But it
see.
also felt like a character that I could reach out and touch in a way that I couldn't
Mm,
other version of Burroughs, you know,
yeah.
that I found in Queer was somebody who I felt I knew how to talk to.